Social media is a divisive concept to its core, and the act of banning users from platforms is no different. It's quickly become one of the greatest debates in the digital age, a topic that's created ripple effects for every social media user in the world. Recent years have provided high-profile bans reaching several corners of American society, ranging from former US President Donald Trump to right-wing conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, and outside of the political realm and former baseball player Aubrey Huff. There's real noise to this topic, if you know what I mean. So much so that it often makes it hard to properly analyze it for what it is. We hear so much about what is right, what is constitutional, what should be commonly accepted when it comes to what is and what is not allowed on privately owned social outlets. It's kind of a jumbled mess. The very idea of social media user bans has become indefinitely linked to the current political landscape of the United States. Either way, let's try and dive into why this topic has become such a hotly contested one, and why I ultimately believe social platforms should maintain the right to ban users in an effort to limit misinformation spread. The public is what powers social media and drives the internet. We are the product. Companies seek to learn all they can about us, our habits, and what we like and dislike. Algorithms need us to sustain life and thus sustain revenue for the social media giants that many of us stick to. This is exactly why it's critical to examine social media bans through the public's immediate and long-term perspectives. Social media companies should be free to take necessary steps that are fueled by the public's best interests, even if those decisions sometimes mean removing someone from the platform. Social media user bans impact us all, despite social media often feeling like a solo adventure. That's why it's crucial that we look at the implications of these bans and how they impact us, the future of social as a whole, and who holds the power. Perhaps most importantly, I think it's necessary that we create a common understanding of what private censorship means and what First Amendment violations actually look like. News cycles often distort the true reasons of why a figure was banned from a platform, offering an instant chance for false narratives to spread. What some may call a blatant violation of their rights is very often just an example of private censorship, the kind that breaks no laws and infringes on zero rights. We must ensure that society at large understands what the First Amendment prohibits and protects, as it stands against government censorship but allows for private censorship. While political factions and their bases may not agree with these choices, these private services are just that, private, and they're allowed to moderate who can and can't use their platforms. The idea of banning an individual user could seem like a distant memory now on Elon Musk's Twitter or on Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook, where Donald Trump and countless others have been reinstated. The reality, though, is that the very concept of an individual user ban is morphing every day. If you followed media news in even a distant fashion, then you know things have been changing, and fast. We can't become fatigued to the highly consequential decisions made by these platforms with such vast amount of power. We must stay alert. You already heard me mention Musk and Zuckerberg, and for good reason. A ban is a decision made by a group of people overseeing their product, but it's also rooted in the leaders of these social giants. To accept bans without clear reasoning would mean becoming complicit in the uneven world that is social media censorship and content moderation. By holding these leaders accountable, we can hopefully set forth new, universally adaptable guidelines for moderating users on platforms. Even if you're pro-social media user bans like I am, there are legitimate concerns about who can issue them. Regardless of what voice, personality, or profile is silenced by an outlet, the ability to simply pick and choose who or what receives bans does remain a major concern. When we see a lack of a platform's clear regulation or patterns in issuing bans, it's equally worrisome, as it creates a mixed message to social users who may not fully know what is or what isn't allowed on that specific outlet. It's important we can acknowledge the inherent difficulties of this topic while also seeing the perspectives from its supporters and critics. I fall in line with what seems to be a growing group among the population. Those who know that social media user bans should be allowed, but that the transparency and guidelines behind them must be clearer for all involved, stemming from the top of organizations. It's a relatively simple concept. As a private company, giants like Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok are free to choose what is acceptable content under their own umbrellas, while also holding the right to say who can or can't use it. Those who are in favor of social media bans often fall in line with this thinking. If social outlets aren't considered common carriers, which are businesses that receive special treatment and protections and extra rules they may have to follow, then they must be viewed as private companies with the ability to regulate what is on their platform. Common carriers were originally actual transportation, like railways and postal services, the connections that enabled society to see new things, interact with one another, and gain knowledge. Of course, social media is a new century version of this. If we're to adopt a new idea of what a common carrier is, perhaps social media could fall underneath this. But as it stands right now, as private entities, they set their own terms of what is or isn't permissible on its grounds, acting not as a censor, but as a company looking out for its own interests. However, as stated earlier, it's crucial that social companies balance looking out for their own interest and the public's too. We know this is easier said than done. From spam accounts to neo-Nazis, QAnon conspiracy theorists, and anti-Semites, these were just some of the accounts that were initially welcomed back to Twitter after Elon Musk purchased it. Reducing the creation and spread of digital hate speech, objectively hurtful content, and insightful language have long been pillars of individual user bans. Banning figures that routinely share disinformation, hate speech, or incite violence does reduce their reach and direct communication with followers. For figures like Donald Trump, David Duke, and Alex Jones, to name a few, social platforms reason that the bans are proactive measures to reduce further violence or the spread of misinformation on their platforms. By enforcing such bans, social media platforms take accountability in reducing the open spread of known lies. Supporters of social platforms' right to ban users argue that we must create common guidelines and practices for removing users from apps. Fundamentally, those who face bans will have clearly violated the terms of service, whether it be through spreading false information or harmful language. Users and platforms alike must have a mutual understanding that ban-worthy posts are not protected by the First Amendment. The relationship between platform and user must also be clear, and that the companies are exercising their own powers under the Constitution as free market enterprises. By establishing a clear baseline between the public and social media companies, user bans could potentially become a less divisive topic. The simple truth is that if you don't follow a company's stated rules, you're going to face some form of consequence. The harshest version of that comes in the form of being kicked off the platform. Donald Trump's ban served as an insightful lens into what world leaders think of social media user bans. Aside from the immediate GOP and right-wing media reactions slamming Twitter and Facebook in the United States, other leaders took notice too. Then German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the decision was, quote, problematic, and said freedom of opinion is of, quote, elementary significance. Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, said, quote, I don't like anybody being censored or taking away from the right to post a message on Twitter or Facebook. I don't agree with that. I don't accept that. Adding to the list of critics was Russian opposition figure and Putin critic Alexei Navalny, who called the move, quote, an unacceptable act of censorship, saying it was, quote, based on emotions and personal political preferences, ones that would mark the beginning of free speech restrictions around the world. Boris Johnson, the former United Kingdom Prime Minister, opted to take a different stance. He said, quote, social media companies are entitled to make their own moderation decisions, adding that they, quote, must be held accountable for the consistent, transparent, and effective enforcement of their terms and conditions. I side with Boris here. Critics of bans say social platforms offer no clear idea of what gets users kicked off. It's a valid concern, as plenty of notable accounts were still up and running in the wake of Trump's ban, including the Iranian Supreme Leader, who advocated for genocide and engaged in Holocaust denial on Twitter, or authoritarian government officials from China, who called for violence several times. The point critics make is how can a US president be banned, but equally violent accounts that violate platforms' terms survive? This is why social giants must ban all who violate the terms, not just specific accounts. Detractors also say bans stand against everything social media represents as a marketplace for the global free exchange of ideas. Twitter doesn't always specify exactly which posts result in a user being banned, but in major cases with high-profile accounts, it often does reveal semi-detailed explanations as to why a certain account receives the boot. Historically, Twitter has prohibited content that glorifies violence, hateful conduct, and harassment, in addition to other violations. These generally lead to temporary suspensions or permanent bans. As Elon's Twitter stands right now, accounts that engage in abusive behavior, threats, or account impersonations can be temporarily or permanently kicked off. Facebook lists a few categories of content that it doesn't allow, ranging from nudity, hate speech, credible threats, direct attacks on groups, self-harm, spam, and impersonations. These all sound like reasons someone would be banned, and they do indeed go against what the company calls its community standards. Meta, Facebook's parent company, has instituted a strike system across Facebook and Instagram, where if the user goes past the individual 10 strikes, your account will be disabled. TikTok bans users for the following reasons. 1. They don't meet the minimum age requirement. 2. They have impersonations of another account or entities in a deceptive manner. 3. They have violations that range from child sexual abuse, violence, non-consensual sexual acts, human trafficking, torture, or creating another account to avoid restrictions on a primary account. 4. IP violations. And 5. They have reached their strike threshold. YouTube might not be a traditional social media network, and it might not be a social media network at all by technical definition, but its power in the video world on digital spaces is undeniable. YouTube can terminate accounts if they post abusive or hateful content, in addition to severe abuse like predatory behavior, spam, or pornography. Channels or accounts specifically dedicated to hate speech, impersonation, or harassment can all be subject to bans. With all this talk about bans, the central question remains, do they actually do anything? The answer is somewhat of a mixed bag, depending on where you look. In Donald Trump's case, digital misinformation around election fraud saw a 73% decrease on Twitter after his account and several allies of his were silenced. Plus, general conversations surrounding election fraud dropped from 2.5 million to 688,000 mentions across several social outlets in the immediate week after he was banned. The numbers paint an overall encouraging picture for the effectiveness of user bans, highlighting how these accounts with large followings consistently amplified each other's false content. While these results were strong returns at the moment for user bans, their long-term effectiveness still remains mostly undefined. Others say that relying on the constant removal of those who post false or misleading content isn't a meaningful path forward. Critics of these bans say that if conspiracy theorists or extremists are driven off mainstream platforms like Facebook and Twitter, they could be driven to parts of the internet that are simply unreachable, thus making it harder to truly reduce the amount of misinformation they spread. The important distinction here, though, is that removals could remain more effective for spreaders of hate speech and illegal content, while those who spread scientific misinformation could still be subject to a ban. In a study that analyzed 5,216 suspended users on Reddit, 76% of those wound up creating accounts on Gab after their last Reddit post, presumably following a suspension. Gab, of course, being the blog and social networking app that is home to a large far-right user count. On Twitter, misinformation surrounding several topics have seen large spikes since Elon Musk took over, as he's reinstated accounts that regularly lie and reduce the platform's overall content moderation efforts. When Twitter announced its monumental decision to permanently suspend U.S. President Donald Trump's account after the January 6th insurrection, the company framed it as a preventative, proactive move to reduce the risk of further incitement of violence. Of course, the company was referring to his tweets and rhetoric leading up to the attack, arguing that the president's posts had played key roles in leading to violence and destruction. Later that same year in June, Trump was booted off Facebook and Instagram for what would be a 2-year period. Like Twitter, Facebook leaned into Trump's presence as a risk, a looming and unpredictable instigator of violence through his rhetoric alone. The company stated that it would only reinstate him if his risk to public safety has receded. While some championed the move, saying it was an effective means of limiting his promotion of outright lies, many argued it wasn't enough. Critics who argued a permanent suspension was justified pointed to the fact that Trump, along with his key allies who also faced bans, would be allowed back online just in time for a 2024 campaign push, despite his direct role in inciting a potential coup. Puzzling, too, is the fact that Facebook didn't offer exact reasons as to why it was only a 2-year ban, or what its own criteria would be for his eventual reinstatement. Twitter also removed Alex Jones and his media outlet InfoWars in 2018, stating that action was taken, quote, based on new reports of tweets and videos that violated the platform's abusive behavior policy, in addition to past account violations. From Marjorie Taylor Greene to disgraced U.S. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, many prominent political figures at the national and fringe levels have received some form of a social media ban. To this group, these bans act as charges, an igniter of emotion within their political base, to hurl anger and criticism at social platforms and big tech in general. We must also rethink content moderation from both the platform and individual's perspective. Platforms could engage in shadow banning, a tactic that Reddit has employed in limiting the reach of certain accounts. Users who regularly post content that violate platform guidelines can still post, but no other users can see those posts. In effect, troublesome users are dwindled down to an audience of one, that being themselves. Can we really reach a point where this desire for unlimited digital access can coexist with the need to moderate content? I think we can. Collective resilience could be one of the greatest assets we have in accomplishing this, and it can come in many forms. Rather than outright bans, demonetization and preventing the amplification of misinformation could serve as useful tools in identifying suspicious accounts for all users to be aware of. In effect, we can enable individuals and society to be aware of the common misconceptions and falsehoods about a given issue or news topic. By joining together to understand the digital threats that we all face knowingly and unknowingly, we can create a general population that is digitally savvy and supremely confident in its ability to analyze content in all of its forms. Users can increase the quality of the news and content that they share if we can properly shift this conversation to increasing overall accuracy online. User bans can be an effective part of reducing misinformation online, but they cannot be the only tool we use. They must merely be one component of a larger system in this new era of content moderation and the fight for truth.